There is a revealing new poll to tell you about that focuses on the South. It looks at a wide variety of issues from the president to what is most important to viewers. We want to welcome John Lipinski. He is the director of the elections unit at NBC News. He put this poll together and he's going to explain the findings to us. John, welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start a little bit by something that I read in the synopsis of this, saying that the South is actually an underpolled area. What do you all mean by that?
Well, oftentimes, even though that there's some sort of battleground states in the South, obviously, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, also now, the South has not been as competitive, at least at the presidential level, in the past. And so, with the focus on a lot of horse race polling, we just see we see fewer polls in the South than we do in some other parts of the country. And we think that the South is just such an important region, and also obviously the individual states are important, that we thought that at NBC News that we should poll more in that region.
So when did this polling take place?
So this polling, we literally pulled this poll a couple days ago on Wednesday, so it's fresh, and we polled essentially the first couple weeks of July.
Okay, the first couple weeks of July, and 11 states involved in this.
That is right, and with a focus though on four southern states. We did Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and also Tennessee. And this is there's a sort of a time series here, and what I mean by that, this is our third iteration of this. So we've been doing this for a while, and we do them every few months.
So the first on your list, President Trump's approval rating. What can you tell us about your findings there?
Yeah, so what I can tell you, let me say just a little bit about nationwide. His approval, it's still not, it's still under 50. It's at 48%. But for President Trump, that's a pretty good number. What's interesting in Georgia, of course, is that it's the same as the nation. In the South overall, though, Trump is sitting at a higher approval rating of 54%.
Interesting. Did you find any factors that may be leading to that?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we've seen, obviously one factor is that the South is more Republican, but even more than that is that when we look at the South across the region and in the individual states, the economy, people just really feel that the economy is doing great. And traditionally, when people think that the economy is doing well, that feeds into a higher approval rating for a sitting president.
What about the makeup of, I guess, the topography of the South? Maybe that's not the right word, but there aren't a concentration of very large cities in the southern region. We kind of think of that more as a Northeast thing or maybe a West Coast thing, or of course Texas has some big cities. But is the South more rural than other areas, and might that play a factor?
It is more rural, and obviously when we actually sort of look at the composition of the electorate, more rural voters tend to be more Republican. But there's, in a lot of the South, there's also a lot of suburbs. And so oftentimes we think of the country as being rural and urban, but in fact the suburbs are a huge portion of the country, and there's quite a bit of that in the South. And that's very mixed when we actually look at attitudes, across the board, policy issues, vote choice preference questions. And so the suburbs are pretty key, and again, very important in the South.
So you mentioned the economy. What other issues are you finding are most important to voters in our region?
Yeah, so one of the big issues is immigration, and we saw that basically in the South, but we saw that in the nation. And so immigration typically is not an issue that polls at an extremely high level, but President Trump and also the Democrats to some extent have really put a lot of attention on it. And so that issue has kind of skyrocketed from the last time we did our poll. Healthcare is also important. But the healthcare and economy are ones that usually are pretty traditional issues that have that usually poll fairly high. So the immigration one, it might not be surprising given it's so much part of the national conversation, but it is different than what we've seen in the past.
So our coverage area for this TV station is obviously in Georgia. We're in Savannah, but we also have several counties in South Carolina. So what can you tell us specifically about how those two states, or the findings that were there for those two states?
Yeah, so even though you have obviously a market where you cover both states, Georgia's different than South Carolina. Georgia is like, definitely when we look at in states like South Carolina versus Georgia, President Trump's approval rating is higher in a state like South Carolina. And sort of in addition, there's more, when we look at sort of the partisan issues, whether it be abortion, where again we see a huge split between Republicans and Democrats. On things like that, we see differences. Georgia's really a microcosm of the country. Oftentimes, when we look at the national poll versus the results in the state poll, a lot of results are very close to each other. And so, particularly on the abortion issue, where a strong majority of the people of Georgia support keeping Roe v. Wade in place, versus other parts of the South where we've seen much stronger support for potentially overturning it.
Is there anything else in your findings that you'd like to address that we haven't talked about so far?
Well, one thing that we did touch on is in the poll, is not, though we didn't put a lot of attention on it, is we did do the Democratic primary horse race question. And one of the things that we see in the South and in Georgia, and also we'd see it in just the South as a whole, is that Vice President Biden does much better in the South. He polls, potentially as his legacy of being with the Obama in the Obama administration, is he polls very strong with African Americans. And so if we were to look at like when, Vice President Biden is sort of looking at the numbers across the country, he has a lot of strength in the South. The question will be, of course, will that continue as he gets pushed and challenged more in these upcoming debates? But as it stands right now, he'd be smiling when he looks at these numbers.
Did you find a clear number 2 in the race for the Democratic nomination in the South?
No. What we're really seeing there is we're seeing splits. With Harris, Warren, and Sanders. The one thing that did stand out, because obviously there's a larger proportion of African Americans in a lot of southern states, is that Senator Warren does particularly poorly with African American voters. She's only polling at 5% of African American voters that are likely, that are Democrats, versus where she's polling 22%. With whites. And so that's really the big difference between her and Biden, for example, in the region, that racial split.
And what are your plans for a future poll? Are there different insights you're looking to gather in the next few weeks and months?
Well, the next iteration of this particular poll, where we, with all the southern states, will be in October. And that one will look at some of the important governor's races that are upcoming in November, and then obviously with an eye towards the Democratic primaries. And what we want to do is really see which issues are resonating with the voters, and if that changes. Right now immigration is extremely important. The question is, especially as the Democratic primary heats up, does the conversation shift? So we're always looking for those shifts, and obviously we're very interested in what voters want, because in the end, we elect people to represent the views of the people, and so that's why we do this polling in the first place.
John Lipinski is the Director of Elections Unit for NBC News. We thank you for your time today.
Thank you.